There we are. So welcome to the History of Ideas Reading Club with me, Samuel Woodall. I'm hosting this session today, which is on industrialization and Karl Marx, a session that was originally going to be in person, but now is online. And yeah, we're going to be looking at the context and the thinking of one of probably the most commonly known revolutionary thinker that we'll look at in this canon. And particularly on the political side, but probably if you hear the term revolution, then your mind would immediately be drawn to the work and life of Karl Marx. So what are we talking about when we talk about industrialization and Marx? Well, this session examines industrialization within the framework of the long 19th century. So this is a term usually referred to by historians as between 1760 and 1914, the beginning of the First World War. It's understood not simply as a period of technological change, but as a profound reorganization of social, economic, and intellectual life, with Britain as its epicenter. This lecture situates Karl Marx within this transformation, emphasizing his formation through German philosophy, British political economy, and the empirical realities of industrial capitalism, observed most acutely during his years in London in the 1850s and 1860s. From an intellectual historian's perspective, Marx is approached not as an inevitable culmination of industrial modernity, but as one intervention among many whose claims to a science of history reflect wider 19th century ambitions to systematize knowledge under conditions of rapid change. So what is this long 19th century that I just mentioned? It's important to understand this concept in history referred to as periodization and its meaning. The long 19th century, a term popularized by Eric Hobsbawm, spans from the French Revolution through the Congress of Vienna, the revolutions of 1848, and culminates in the ruptures of 1914, thereby privileging structural transformation over discrete political events. Britain's population expanded dramatically during this time from approximately 7 million in 1760 to 21 million by 1851, and to over 45. The slides, are the slides not displayed? Can people not see the slides?
Yeah.
Jack, you can see the slides as well? Jack?
You're on mute, Jack.
Sorry, yes, I can.
You can see the slides. Fine. The slides isn't displayed. Oslem, I'm not sure. You might want to.
It might, in fairness, it might be the view because it does it on my one. If you simply just click on the main screen, it might give you a different view. That might fix it, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's anything I can do my end to change anything. Yeah, there's nothing I can see.
I'll put a copy of the slides in the chat in the meantime, in case.
Oh yes, yeah. I can drop the PowerPoint in there actually if you want. Just very quickly, I've got it here. Have you got it there?
I've also got it here.
Oh, you do it, Jack, and I'll continue.
Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, sorry. Continuing on. So it was over 45 million by 1911. Reflecting both agricultural improvements and industrial employment opportunities that drew populations into urban centres. Urbanisation crossed a decisive threshold in 1851, when for the first time, more than 50% of the British population lived in towns and cities, compared to roughly 20% in 1801 at the dawn of the century, marking Britain as the first fully industrial society. Again, from this sort of intellectual history standpoint, such periodization itself constitutes an interpretive act, privileging economic and demographic structures over political narrative, and thereby aligning implicity with the kinds of structural expansion later advanced by Marx. But what was happening simultaneously at this time in terms of in society, but also in terms of these social historical transformations? There was technological transformation and an industrial breakthrough. The industrial transformation was driven by a cluster of technological innovations, including the spinning jenny in 1764, the water frame in 1769, and most decisively the improved steam engine developed by James Watt in 1776, which increased efficiency by approximately 75% and enabled the relocation of production away from water sources. Railway expansion accelerated the integration of national markets, beginning with the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825, and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway coming soon after in 1830, which dramatically reduced transport costs and time, with freight costs falling by up to 60% in some sectors. British iron production increased from roughly 17,000 tonnes in 1740 to over 2.25 million tonnes by 1850, while coal output rose from approximately 3 million tonnes in 1700 to over 50 million by the mid-century, which underpins this idea of industrial expansion that Marx was living through at this time. From an intellectual historian's perspective, these innovations did not merely increase productivity, but transformed the organisation of time, labour and discipline, replacing customary rhythms with the standardised temporality of the factory, a shift that becomes central to Marx's later critique of capitalist production. So this idea that time suddenly becomes part of economic value, much more than it had before, you know. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, a feudal order would have engaged serfs and slaves and those who worked the land, but it wasn't so demarcated by production amounts alongside allocations of time. This was a massive transformation, which obviously, one thing I didn't mention, the invention of the clock, and that is a massive shift in terms of being able to monitor our daily lives in terms of allocating hours and sort of chunking up our days into certain allocations of labour and leisure.
Yeah, the rise of time, Samuel, also seemed to have something to do with the need to keep schedule of all the trains going through the different towns as well. I think that was also quite a significant catalyst to that.
No, completely. And yeah, alongside trains, you also have, this is the canal age for those interested in in such things. This is the age of the canal, where you have the Grand Union Canal shipping coal from various different parts of the country, but particularly coming down from the Midlands into London, all of these canals connecting to ship coal into the epicenter of this new industrial mechanism that Britain was becoming. So alongside the trains, you have that waterborne form of transport as well. But what are the social consequences of urbanisation and the making of this working class? Because remember, class distinctions, obviously there's always been in society rigid class distinctions between high and low, but even into the age of the Enlightenment that we discussed last time, you have reference to what I suppose historians call a middling sort, but you never have a middle class. You don't have lower class, middle class, upper class. You have a sort of those from the low class who have gone into the new trades, artisanal trades from the medieval period onwards, but they don't form a class, so to speak. They form kind of aspiring individuals within the lower class, and then the higher class completely out of reach. And this is a dynamic we'll come back to later in terms of this sort of paternalism that have sort of shrouded class tension. But during this period of urbanisation, there was a making of the working class. Industrialisation produced this rapid urban expansion. Manchester growing from approximately 25,000 people in 1750 to over 400,000 by 1851, while cities like Birmingham and Leeds and Sheffield experienced similar transformations tied to specific industrial specialisations. Working conditions were often severe, with factory labour commonly extending to 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 days a week, and widespread child labour involving children as young as 5 or 6 employed in mills and mines. Life expectancy for the urban working class in cities such as Manchester in the 1840s could fall as low as 17 years, reflecting the overcrowding that was seen and poor sanitation and disease. Engels, in his The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1845, provided one of the earliest systematic empirical accounts of these conditions. As far as the intellectual historian is concerned, industrialization generated not only new economic realities, but new conceptual categories, including the working class, the proletariat itself, which Marx would later theorize as a structural position within capitalism rather than merely a descriptive social group. But Marx wasn't just inheriting the social context of its time, and this is what we're interested in here in the History of Ideas Club. He was also inheriting a legacy, quite a new emergent school of thought, which was economics. The intellectual foundations for Marx's critiques were laid by classical political economists such as Adam Smith, who we've discussed before, in his Wealth of Nations in 1776, which articulated the division of labour and the self-regulating market, and also David Ricardo, whose Principles of Political Economy in 1817 advanced a labour theory of value. Ricardo argued that the value of goods was determined by the labour required to produce them, while profits were inversely related to wages, creating an inherent tension within capitalist production. So the more energy and time you put into a product, the more it is worth, and therefore the salary that you deserve. But obviously, that if your salary is increasing and the even if the profit, the amount of money that what you're producing is raising as well, there's a tension there between, well, who is actually going to make the money if you're needing to get paid X amount and profit is disappearing because the salary also should be reflective of the person's value in the production of said good. Malthus's essay on population in 1798 introduced the idea that population growth would outstrip food supply, contributing to debates on poverty and wages. Marx's originality lies, for an intellectual historian, not in rejecting these frameworks outright, but in radicalizing them, bringing them together, transforming analytical categories into tools of critique, and embedding them within a broader historical and philosophical system. But there were radical precursors in the politics as well as the economics. So these economists maybe weren't radical themselves, but provided a sort of intellectual framework for Marx when it came to trying to judge systems of value and the value of labour. But there were political precursors and contemporaries as well, and I think it's important to discuss those because Marx isn't an outlier here. The thought of Marx emerged within a broader and highly contested mid-19th century field of radical political ideas, including socialism, anarchism, and individualist critiques of authority, indicating that Marxism was one intervention among many rather than an isolated or particularly dominant doctrine at its inception. Among the most provocative figures was Max Stirner, whose The Ego and Its Own in 1844 advanced an extreme form of individualism, rejecting all abstract ideals, including state, society, and even humanity, as oppressive constructs, thereby directly challenging the collectivist assumptions underpinning both socialism and Marx's emerging theory of class. Equally significant was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose declaration "Property is Theft" in his What is Property in 1840 articulated an early anarchist critique of private ownership, while simultaneously opposing state socialism and centralized authority, placing him in direct intellectual conflict with Marx, most notably in Marx's polemical response, The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847, directed at Proudhon. The broader anarchist tradition, later developed by figures such as Bakunin, emphasized the immediate abolition of the state and rejected Marx's notion of a transitional socialist phase, leading to deep divisions within the International Working Men's Association, which was founded in 1864, which ultimately split in the early 1870s along Marxist versus anarchist lines. Alongside these thinkers were Jack, please.
Sam, about the last slide.
Yeah.
The conflict between Proudhon and Marx. So does that mean that the notion that property is theft isn't an essentially Marxist notion? Because it is quite a popular idea now. It seems to be co-opted by a lot of people who would call themselves Marxists, but it's not an original notion.
it's more pure, I guess, in terms of what Proudhon is saying. Proudhon is saying there doesn't need to be these. We're just about to get to a bit about Hegel, where I thought you might be interested to maybe give a little debrief ahead of next week's session.
Sure.
But essentially getting straight to the reality that property in itself is theft, not part of something that workers will claim, but just, because in that sort of Hegelian sense, Marx wants to build up to it. He thinks there needs to be bourgeois revolution, then the proletarian revolution, and then the workers will claim it for themselves. But for Proudhon, property as a whole is theft. To work within the concept of property is completely erroneous for him, because for Marx, the property will be seized by the collective workers as a whole. I'm raising my fist like the fist behind me. But Proudhon wants to skip that out and say the concept of property itself is corrupt and just wrong, and wants to go straight for the abolition of property altogether.
Okay.
Whereas property would still exist as a concept in a sense under a Marxian, at least within the dialectic, because the property needs to be seized by the workers in the last stage of the kind of revolutionary dialectic, if you see what I mean.
Okay, yes.
But we move on to a few others who are quite interesting. Some utopian socialists, such as Henry de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen, an Englishman who some people will have learnt about maybe at university, who's proposed cooperative communities, reform schemes in the early decades of the 19th century, often grounded in moral or religious visions rather than systematic theories of historical development. So Owen had kind of come up with these ideas of towns where you would get your board and lodgings and all would be provided for you whilst you worked in the kind of whatever the kind of town was dedicated to producing. But everything would be provided for you in a sort of very pastoral and paternalistic way in terms of raising you, rearing you, looking after you. But you had to go and do your bit to contribute in terms of whatever the community was dedicated towards, and you would be left with a green card. Well, it was a block of wood painted, and on one side the block of wood was painted in green and one side was painted in red as to whether you'd met essentially your quota for the day. That's the kind of only ominous foreboding element of Robert Owen's kind of idealistic cities that he built, that maybe sort of foreshadows more Soviet forms of kind of whether you've met your quota, whether you've met your purpose in terms of as part of the economy. But these were quite radical views for the time and radical concepts that Fourier, Saint-Simon, and Owen were developing. But Marx and Engels also criticised these figures as utopian in contrast to their own scientific form of socialism, as articulated in works such as the Communist Manifesto that people will have most likely heard of, arguing that earlier socialist thought lacked an understanding of the true structural dynamics of capitalism and the centrality of the class struggle that had to go on before the ultimate seizing of power and property. From an intellectual historian perspective, the diversity of these radical traditions highlights the fluidity and uncertainty of 19th century political thought, in which competing visions of emancipation, individualist, anarchist, cooperative, and revolutionary, coexisted and clashed, with Marxism ultimately emerging as one particularly influential synthesis, rather than a predetermined endpoint.
Oh, yeah.
So what was the philosophical legacy here? Well, Hegel provided the philosophical framework within which Marx was initially trained, particularly through works such as the Phenomenology of Spirit and the Philosophy of Right. Hegel conceptualized history as a rational process driven by dialectical movement in which contradictions are resolved through synthesis, a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis. His famous description of Napoleon as the world spirit on horseback in 1806 illustrates his belief in historical actors as embodiments of broader rational processes. For the intellectual historian, Marx inherits in Hegel's dialectical method but rejects its idealism, replacing the movement of spirit with material forces and thereby reorienting the direction of historical explanation. Jack, I don't know if you'd like to maybe expand on any of those points in terms of Hegel's influence here, or what you would see as sort of Hegel's legacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good summary. It's quite difficult to understand where Hegel comes from, but it has to do with a shift that's going on in German philosophy, which we call the turn to the subject. Hegel is convinced that sort of the true significance of things, the true meaning of things is relative to mind, and so he conceives of history as call it the working out of consciousness or spirit through the constant back and forth, or the back and forth of opposing forces. It's an idea that's as old as Plato. Plato writes about the battle of the giants, which is his way of talking about the eternal, what he considers to be an eternal philosophical dispute between the one and the many. Hegel, yeah, it is articulating that same pattern here. And he sees the sort of the tension of opposites in the sphere of idea, the driving force of history. Marx, as you say, accepts the method, but thinks that it's the material conditions rather than the abstract ideas and concepts and ideologies which is the primary movement. He thinks that the idea are formulated in response to material necessity.
Yeah, no,
and
exactly.
To view that one out.
Yeah, completely. And I guess, yeah, this idea that classes aren't sort of descriptive intellectual formations of like what is a working class in terms of ideas, what is a middle class in terms of ideas, what is an upper class in terms of ideas. It really is, for Marx, something much more structural, in the sense of they are a cog within a machine. There's no kind of necessary battle of ideas between the middle class and the lower class and the upper class and the other classes. It's very much that they are structural elements within a sort of living machine of history and just practical reality. But there's some historical fragments of some of Hegel's more radical thinking, which sort of paves the way for some revolutionary thought from his Bern period. How dangerous the disproportionate wealth of certain citizens is to even the freest form of constitution, and how it is capable of destroying liberty itself, is shown by history in the example of Pericles of Athens, of the patricians in Rome, the downfall of whom the menacing influence of the Gracchi, and in others in vain sought to retard through proposals of agrarian laws. It would be an important topic of investigation to see how much of the strict right of property would have to be sacrificed for the sake of a durable form of republic. We have perhaps not done justice to the system of sansculottism in France in seeking the source of its demand for greater equality of property solely in rapacity. I don't know, Jack, if that sort of feeds in somewhat to some of these ideas that Hegel's grappling with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of I find it a bit opaque because there's some quite specific references. Pericles of Athens, obviously the great Athenian general, who makes a big speech about Athens being the school of the Greeks in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, well, actually quite early on in the Peloponnesian War. His reign is generally considered the sort of the only period of true democracy in Athens, but Hegel seems to think that here you have even the freest form of constitution is capable of destroying liberty itself. This is again the tension. So I think you can look at this is how Marxist writers also write about, say, the Enlightenment, a period of reason that seems to undermine freedom itself, a period which values liberty and freedom, but also paradoxically runs away with itself and actually enslaves us. It's a very I find the analysis generally quite compelling, but they sometimes get a bit unwieldy and abstract. I think a lot of it is rooted in in part, like, you have too much of a narrow focus on one value and you become less attentive to other values which conspire against it.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I agree, but I think it's interesting to see something like that line. How much of the strict right of property would have to be sacrificed for the sake of a durable form of republic? This does feel like a
yeah,
precursor to what Marx is talking about.
absolutely. It's also something that Thomas More investigates a little bit in the 1500s, which is, it's interesting that this question keeps coming up to people.
And well,
And Plato too.
it's the perennial debate of liberty versus justice, isn't it? It's how far the liberties go before justice. How far do liberties go before justice is somewhat thrown by the wayside, and how far can justice go before liberty is thrown by the wayside?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a good example just to pause on for a bit, because I think this makes the thinking of the dialectic very concrete. So you have this radical right to property. Let's say you don't really have any legislation against property, but I guess the way these thinkers sort of look at this is, well, that's great if you are able to procure property, but if you're unable to, the fact that other people can and you're unable to increasingly alienates you from the possibility of procuring property, because they're going to get all that they can. You don't have necessarily the means to get anything, and they take up everything from the pool, the supply pool.
Yeah, completely.
So that's one way you see, oh well, we think we're thinking about liberty because we let people get their property, but the real circumstances actually are much more complicated.
And then an added element to that is that obviously, all of the rights and liberties of the Enlightenment are essentially invested in the concept of having property. So you actually, as a citizen, not only are you alienated from property itself, but you're also alienated from the social contract, because essentially you have no stake in the social contract.
Yeah, precisely. So in a sense, the liberty just becomes an entirely abstract notion. It's not something that the majority of people are actually experiencing. It doesn't. It's not functional for them.
Exactly. And then people feel alienated, isolated, and they then don't conform. And this is where the kind of revolutionary element does, or perhaps some people would say in our modern day, perhaps the sort of where elements of criminality come from and things like that. If you don't have a stake in the social contract, why would you conform to the rules and regulations of the social contract?
Yeah.
No, interesting. But we must move on. We must get to Marx. We still haven't got to Marx yet.
Well, plenty of time.
And plenty of time. Marx, his life and intellectual formation. Marx was born in Trier in 1818, studied law and philosophy in Bonn and Berlin, and became involved with the young Hegelians in the 1840s, who were a radical movement. I don't know how much Jack knows about the young Hegelians in terms of as a group, but they were a radical political movement at the time, and philosophical, obviously, in the 1840s, before moving to Paris in 1843, where he encountered socialist thought and began his collaboration with Friedrich Engels. Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto in February 1848, coinciding with revolutionary upheavals across Europe, before Marx settled in London following the failure of these revolutions. During the 50s and 60s, Marx conducted extensive research in the British Museum Reading Room, culminating in the publication of Das Kapital, Volume 1 in 1867. From an intellectual historian's perspective, Marx's thought is inseparable from his exile here from London as the centre of global capitalism, providing both empirical and material and intellectual stimuli for his critique. So what was he saying in these works? The concepts of capitalism, exploitation, and alienation. Marx divides capitalist society into two primary classes: the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, who sell their labour for wages, with this relationship structured by exploitation. The concept of surplus value refers to the difference between the value produced by labour and the wages paid to workers, forming the basis of capitalist profit. Marx also develops the concept of alienation, describing the workers' estrangement from the product of labour, the process of labour, their own human potential, and from other workers. Alienation, for the historian, reflects Marx's continued engagement with Hegelian philosophy, revealing the persistence of a moral and anthropological dimension within his economic critique.
Alienation, I think, is also is a key Hegelian term from recollection.
And one that would go on to be very much a sociological one in the next century as well.
Yeah, yeah.
In what ways, Jack, would you say it's Hegelian? And
This is only from recollection. I'd have to look up exactly what sense it had in Hegel. I think it's to do with, so Hegel's very interested in the subject-object dynamic. I mean, we call him an idealist, and by that we mean he's only interested in the subject, but that's not quite accurate. He thinks that objects are sort of more or less just projection of or have the essence in relationship to mind, but obviously he still envisions some kind of constitutive relationship with something distinct from us. He just doesn't think there's a mind independent reality. Anyway, now I think the alienation in Hegel carries the precise sense of when somebody completely outsources their subjectivity into the projection of the mind. So in a sense, they identify themselves with the ideas which they're interested in, or the ideas of culture. So you sort of, I think that's something like the sense of it. You lose your identity in the contemplation of the pure idea.
The mind almost dissociates itself from the temporal reality.
Yeah, one way of thinking about it. Yeah, I think it comes to have a more definitive sense in modernity. Obviously, we're alienated when we're unable to express ourselves, and in Marx that has the specific sense of being able to engage in the body politic and in the ability to actually.
Or Durkheim in the 20th century with the concept of anomie and sort of like completely isolated as an individual in society, without purpose, without drive, without
yeah. And the psychologists, I think, similarly, they talk about it as sort of where your identity becomes sort of lost in the external world.
A sort of neurosis sort of thing.
Yeah, like persona, for instance. So you're never your authentic self. You're never grounded in yourself. You're always reactive to your idea of what others want you to think and say.
Oh, sounding quite existential there, Jack.
Well, a lot of overlap.
And they might come up at the end of this. You never know.
Oh, really?
If you're lucky. But here's some passages from Marx on the alienation of the worker. And just as in religion, the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, of the human brain and human here operates independently of the individual, that is, operates on him as an alien, divine or diabolical activity, so is the worker's activity not his spontaneous activity. It belongs to another. It is the loss of his self. So exactly what we were just saying, I think, it really summarised almost.
Yeah.
The worker sinks to the level of a commodity and becomes indeed the most wretched of commodities, but the wretchedness of the worker is in inverse proportion to the power and magnitude of his production. That the necessary result of competition is the accumulation of capital in a few hands, and thus the restoration of monopoly in a more terrible form. When he says restoration of monopoly, meaning that the idea of this kind of era of free trade and capitalism was supposed to do away with what Adam Smith had been criticizing, which was state monopolies giving out royal charters to certain companies who dominated a sphere. And Marx is analysing something which I think most people would agree to be true, which is that capitalism has facilitated, and some people will say for right, for wrong, has facilitated monopolisation of economic sectors, in the sense that you have a few companies who lead sectors and create relatively high barriers to entry for other smaller companies to then compete against them. We shall, being from a contemporary economic fact, the worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces and the more his production increases in power and extent. The worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more goods he creates. The devaluation of the human world increases in direct relation to the increase in value of the world of things. Labour does not only create goods, it also produces itself and the worker as a commodity, and indeed in the same proportion as it produces goods. So what is he saying there about this inverse relationship as wealth accumulates in a few hands? What is happening to the labour market? What is happening to the workers?
I mean, a key word is this commodification. Well, he talks about, the worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more goods he creates. Yeah, this is quite systematic. The worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces, the more his production increases in power and extent. I mean, why would that be? I mean, because the higher the production, the less his wages. Oh, is that the idea?
I think it's the idea that wealth is accumulating in a few hands. He is staying static. So the disproportionate
I see.
level of wealth is that one is growing massively and one is staying static, so thereby getting smaller against the amount of wealth within the bourgeoisie, within the ruling class.
Yeah, and hence the devaluation of the human world increases in direct relation to the increase in value of the world of things.
Again, exactly that.
And that's
as
precisely
more and more is produced. He's not getting any more for it.
That's precisely the sense of this term commodity. It's the commodification of the individual. Yeah, this is an exact translation of Hegel's sense of alienation, but just in the material context. So you imagine someone ceases to be a subject, but just becomes the exponent for a pure idea. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The wealth is not part of
the labourer becomes an exponent of the capitalist enterprise. Does not see his value go up in proportion with that enterprise. Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the things that, well, maybe you'll get onto this, but obviously a lot of people react quite badly to these kind of analyses these days. And I wonder why that is. Is it because it's just fundamentally no longer tenable, and why might that be? Is this very much describing a certain time and place, or do we have universal principles at work here?
I think in the era of this is still at a time where any economic analysis, we've basically listed the few economists that there had been before Marx. We now live in a time where economics is analysed very differently. Practical realities of the modern world have meant that economics has been able to transform quite a lot in the sense of kind of small business economies that we see in the 20th and 21st century. And this idea of trickle down economics that we all hear, which is that, ultimately where these kind of left-wing ideas are wrong is that because of trickle down economics, the wealth doesn't stay in one static place. There isn't this kind of massive difference that the wealth trickles down, creates more jobs, creates, ultimately better wages. There's an idea that if you're valued, if you're making wealth for people these days, ultimately the wealth will trickle down eventually, because obviously your company or sector or whatever is doing better and is more in demand, so your wages will go up. This is the kind of modern analysis of things. I don't think that, though, fundamentally disproves, and that's why I've never liked the kind of academic chortling around Marxian analysis, because I don't think it fundamentally disproves the point, and we see it on the day-to-day in the modern world, that a few people do grow exponentially in wealth as a result of the the value of labor, the surplus value of labor, the amount that they are producing for the owner class. I don't think that that's ever been disproven. I just think that obviously in a world where economics has developed massively since Marx's time, there's all these counter arguments to it, which can be debated right or wrong. But I think the sort of broad structural analysis that Marx has isn't necessarily wrong. I don't know whether anyone else has a point before Jack and I engage. Dar, I don't know if you think about like how would you say that Marx has been disproved in the modern age, or do you think his fundamental principles still stand?
I mean, I think the outlook is completely different. The way people might interpret it. I mean, it was a very interesting point you said earlier on, in the sense of like what he said about like the rights of property and what that means today compared to what he originally wrote. I think is interesting.
No, you're right, and perhaps that is one of the reasons, again, actually, from what Dara said there, is that perhaps people today are more tied in to property as well, which makes the Marx, if we go back to Marx's time, someone in a workhouse doesn't have any property to have a stake in. We don't have to talk about property just as a house or land or whatever. Like in the modern world, everyone has property that they're somewhat invested in, whether it be things, whether it be renting a flat, whatever. Compared to Marx's time, perhaps that's another shift, that we have become a more capitalist society, in the sense that
property has increased so much, isn't it? It's become more of a it's become more of a need, isn't it? In order to, whether it's renting a property, buying a property, whatever it might be, it's more of a need rather than, I think maybe Marx thinks more of it as a luxury that only the few have access to, maybe.
Yeah. No, I agree. Jack?
I'm sorry, I did zone out a little bit, but I thought it was a thing. But this is generally not my area of expertise in any case.
But no, I guess just people may be more bought into the system now because there's been a massive kind of production boom in the last century in terms of people having things, and therefore they're more invested in property, and therefore Marx's kind of pure argument of those without and with property, and that dialectic doesn't stand so clear cut as it did at his time.
So were you asking me or not?
No, I'm just making a broader point. That's what I'd say maybe is the difference between, and why maybe Marx's views would be derided now by comparison to then.
Yeah.
Do you think his arguments in terms of like bourgeoisie, in terms of like that difference between the people that employ and the people that are workers, do you reckon that still stands now, or do you reckon that's been completely dissected or completely alienated?
I mean, this is a massive question to pose, and obviously we're going through the history of it, and I'm not someone who wants to espouse particular current political views. But what I'd say is, I guess the modern economy has gone through massive transformations that we all see in our day-to-day lives, whether it be in work or just the practical realities of going to a shop or going to any business, which is that in the 50s you had this emergence of the managerial class, and that has massively shifted the dynamic in terms of a bourgeoisie and a proletariat. You now have the sort of middling sort of the medieval period in terms of the sort of aspiring proletariat wanting to be brought in and part of the capitalist system, and that has sort of changed things substantially, because you don't have the direct relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat as sort of the two ends of the spectrum meeting. You have a kind of interim now in capitalist economies that kind of makes those managerial class the people who, I guess in Marx's analysis, would be the proletariat, but kind of petty bourgeoisie, as he would call them. But that's much more widespread. Petty bourgeoisie, all of our societies have a massive swathe of petty bourgeoisie, whether they be shop owners, academics, doctors, whatever, people who are invested in the system of property, and but aren't part of the established bourgeoisie, who are the actual wealth owners, so to speak, property owners. And maybe that also waters down the dynamic that Marx originally had. And this, of course, this is where all the revisionists and all, I can't go through all of it today, but I've put some stuff in at the end. But this is where all the different, if you really wanted to go down a wormhole of Marxian thought, there's all forms of kind of different types of Marxism that emerge in reaction to these different trends within economics. But if we are done with those passages, we'll keep moving on. We still have plenty to cover. 1848, let's go back to the 20th and 21st century. 1848, the revolutions of 1848 spread across France and German states, Austria and Italy, representing a moment of widespread political and social upheaval that shaped Marx's expectations for imminent revolutionary change. The manifesto, published in 1848, famously begins with the declaration that there's a spectre haunting Europe, signalling both the perceived inevitability and urgency of revolutionary transformation. That spectre was communism. By mid-century, approximately 40% of Britain's labour force was employed in industry, providing the social basis for Marx's expectation of proletarian revolution. Most of all, he believed that the best economy well placed for this was England, Britain. For the intellectual historian, the failure of the 1848 revolutions, and all of them ultimately do fail, forced Marx to revise his expectations, contributing to a more complex and less immediately optimistic account of historical development. So what does Marx say in the manifesto? So the bourgeoisie, whether it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervour, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egoistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible, chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. I thought Jack might quite like that passage, because there is a certain nostalgia almost there for a bygone age in terms of, this element of sort of social bonds that once had maintain the relationship. For Marx, he would not be saying that that's any better at time, because he's saying that they are, in the same way that Stirner had said in his Ego and His Own, that they're all apparitions, all spooks and ghosts. But Marx is saying that at least then there was a kind of reason for the exploitation, or a perceived reason for maintaining said exploitation. But the capitalist turn meant that the brutal reality was laid bare to people, because those things were swept away, and cash was the only thing that kept the relationship between bourgeoisie and proletariat going.
It's really interesting analysis. So he had a general, it's very romantic passage. He has a general sense of the dehumanization of the person through history, which is very interesting, because he's a materialist. Sorry.
Bless you.
I mean, I think he's a materialist. That's the reputation. I wonder what he envisions as the way out of that on the materialist paradigm. Obviously, he had this idea of presumably of a world where there isn't, exploitation and exchange value and all of these things.
And obviously in socialist systems there is a return to these kind of, he says, ecstasies of religious fervour. Well, look at the kind of sort of placing on a pedestal and basically religious fanaticism of the Soviet Union around figures like Stalin, around figures like Lenin. There was a return to this kind of idea of, well, how do we how do we create a relationship between the kind of power and the powerless? Well, we basically reignite these kind of medieval sort of emotive elements rather than the blunt rational.
That's really
element
interesting
of
because the socialist regime, they're unbelievably iconographic.
Exactly. Yeah. Completely.
They have very compelling art.
From
And aesthetic doctrines.
socialist realism and this sort of thing.
Yeah, wow. I never made that connection. That's fascinating.
But as I say, I mean, and Marx wouldn't have liked that, because I'm not saying that he's nostalgic about this prior age. What I'm saying is he's saying, workers, wake up, look at the brutal reality that capitalism itself is now exposing to you. None of these myths, as he would see them, now exist. No kind of paternalistic love for you exists anymore. They are literally treating you as a purchase. They are buying you for your time. And they have no regard for you otherwise. As their wealth grows, you get a little piece of that, but you stay the same as their wealth continues to exponentially increase.
Is this really a problem of a particular systematic organization, or is this just a fundamental problem of money itself? The fact that we have to trade something in exchange for a service.
Yeah, that's interesting. In the sense, because are you suggesting that in times gone by, whether it be bartering, whether it be what, are you suggesting that money uniquely has a sort of brutal element to it?
Well, I'm wondering if Marx thinks that. Because I'm wondering if that's really the true object of his critique, because I mean, I never found the Labour theory of value particularly compelling. I find a lot of the surface commentary quite compelling. I mean, I think this is a very strong paragraph on the whole. I think there is something to be said for this way that we've given ourselves false surrogates for freedom rather than the real thing. In many ways, I do think medieval feudal society was far more equitable and probably far more had far greater social mobility. In that, if you really did have talents, and as our friend Derek was explaining to us the other night, and I do think he's right on this. Derek is a friend of ours who's quite the scholar of these subjects. And if you're a medieval peasant with an aptitude for something, you will be identified by your parish priest, and you'll just climb the ranks. Medieval society are very well organized in that respect. The paradox of the time we currently live in is that these institutions of higher education are so saturated that, and arguably there's sort of political problems there as well, that even the talented people can't find a place in the world, and sometimes they're co-opted by people who know how to keep up appearances. Anyway. I thought I got a bit distracted there, but I'm wondering if Marx has something. What he's touching on fundamentally is something about the fact that in this world we needed to come up with money as an intermediary exchange of value, and the idea. I mean, maybe not about money. Maybe it's just about the idea that you employ somebody.
And use them and exploit them, rather than having a sort of more fostered relationship with them in the more feudal sense. Like, so, there is a relationship, an agreed understanding between two individuals that you work for me, but also you are part of my life, estate, etc., and an integrated part of that.
Exactly. So that's sort of the feudal model, and then even the Roman institution of slavery has an element of that. It's quite interesting.
Hot take, Jack.
Well, it seems to be. I mean, I'm trying to understand what exactly he's had a problem with. For the Roman institution of slavery, I think, like you're a member of the household. You're obviously a lesser member, but you're still fed.
But ultimately, for Marx, there would be no climbing the ladder. There would be no. The problem is still there in terms of wealth creation, wealth domination. But it's just shrouded, and I guess you're more invested in it And for him, that means that you have no kind of reason to rebel because you feel like you're kind of a part of it. Whereas for him, the capitalist system, by basically only describing you as something worth a certain portion of cash, shows that you are nothing within the system other than a commodity, other than some hours of labor. But we can continue on. And his cultural context, literature, and social critique. The social consequences of industrialization were explored not only in the political economy, but in literature, most notably by Charles Dickens in Hard Times in 1854 and Victor Hugo in Les Miserables in 1862, both of which render visible the human costs of rapid economic transformation. Dickens' depiction of Coketown, modelled on industrial centres such as Manchester, offer a critique of utilitarianism, particularly associated with Bentham, presenting a world in which human life is reduced to calculation and facts, and where workers endure long hours, limited mobility, and moral impoverishment within an increasingly mechanised society. Hugo's Les Miserables sets against the backdrop of post-revolutionary France and culminating in the 1832 Paris Uprising, which similarly explores poverty, law, and injustice, combining narrative with quasi-sociological observation in a manner comparable to contemporaneous empirical works such as Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England in 1845. While Karl Marx in the Manifesto and Capital seeks to uncover the structural dynamics of capitalism through concepts such as class struggle and surplus value, Dickens and Hugo instead foreground moral experience, individual suffering, and the possibility of reform or redemption rather than systematic transformation. For the intellectual historian, these work together form part of a broader cultural critique of industrial society in which literature and theory converge in diagnosing the same underlying transformations: urbanization, inequality, and the commodification of labor, while differing in method, explanatory ambition than, say, Marx's work. So what were the influence and afterlives of Karl Marx? The influence of Marx extends far beyond his own 19th century context, shaping political movements, philosophical traditions, and institutional developments across the 20th century, though often in ways that diverge significantly from his original formulations. Most immediately, Marx's ideas were taken up and adapted by Vladimir Lenin, whose What is to be Done in 1902 and Leadership in the Russian Revolution transformed Marx's theory into a doctrine of revolutionary vanguardism, arguing that a disciplined party was necessary to bring class consciousness to the proletariat, a significant departure from Marx's expectation of historically emergent class awareness within advanced industrial societies. It must be noted that Marx had never even considered Russia as a country that could go through the kind of transformation that he was suggesting. And I think this alone should really stand as a divergence point. And this is the other problem I find with historical readings of Marx, is that they're so reliant on Lenin and everything that came after in the Soviet Union. But the reality that Marx didn't even consider Russia as somewhere where any of these ideas could exist, because it was so if to him it was still feudal, it didn't make sense. The problem was that it hadn't gone through the sort of bourgeois transformation of capitalism that I think, to try and integrate it, they should be treated as two separate things, Leninism and Marxism. They shouldn't be integrated together. But obviously the Cold War and the sort of century of Soviet communism has obviously impacted that. In the interwar period, Gramsci, writing in his prison notebooks when he was imprisoned by the fascists, reinterpreted Marx through the concept of cultural hegemony, arguing the ruling classes maintained power not only through the economic control that we've discussed, but through intellectual and cultural leadership, thereby expanding Marxist analysis beyond the economic base to include ideology, education, and civil society. And Gramsci's ideas are currently being used in intriguing ways by both left and right. There's an interesting report on how certain populist news channels are being led by sort of think tanks that have been reinterpreting Gramsci for a more sort of right-wing populist approach to counter what they see as kind of liberal hegemony. which is quite interesting to see how these ideas are utilized in the modern world.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, and that's Gramsci there for anyone.
Yeah, of course.
Marx's influence also extended into 20th century philosophy amongst existentialist thinkers such as Sartre, who, in his work The Critique of Dialectical Reason, sought to reconcile Marxism with his existentialism, emphasizing human freedom, subjectivity, and lived experience within the constraints of material conditions, thus attempting to resolve tensions between structural determination and individual agency. Context, Marx's ideas indirectly informed the development of the Labour Party, founded in 1900, whose early intellectual influences included socialist and trade union movements shaped by Marxist analysis of class and labour, though the party itself developed along reformist rather than revolutionary lines, particularly following the adoption of Clause 4 in 1918, which committed to the common ownership of the means of production. So a Marxian trend there, but it has often been said that the Labour Party owes itself more to Methodism than it does to Marxism. Across these cases, Marx's thought is not simply transmitted but transformed, with Lenin emphasising revolutionary organisation, Gramsci cultural power, existentialists human subjectivity, and British socialism parliamentary reform, illustrating the adaptability and contestability of Marx's ideas across different national and intellectual contexts. From an intellectual historical perspective, the plurality of interpretations underscores that Marxism is not a single unified doctrine, but a tradition of argument and reinterpretation, shaped by the specific political, social, and intellectual conditions in which it has been received, and often reflecting concerns such as imperialism, culture, or individual freedom that were only partially developed in Marx's own work. So the key task of intellectual history is to avoid reading Marx through the lens of later developments, particularly the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent history of Marxism in the 20th century. Instead, Marx should be situated within his 19th century context, shaped by German philosophy, British political economy, and the French revolutionary politics and various other continental political influences. His claims should be understood as contingent interventions rather than deterministic predictions. From an intellectual historical perspective, this approach allows us to recover Marx, the real Marx, as a thinker engaged with the problems of his own time. And this kind of response to some of the points we've raised about, what would it refer to today? Well, he's not referring to today. He's referring to his time, rather than as a precursor to later ideological systems that we've seen in the 20th century. Industrialization and the transformation of thought. Industrialization fundamentally reshaped economic production, social organization, and the experience of time, as we've discussed, creating new forms of life and new intellectual challenges. Marx's work represents one of the most systematic attempts to understand and critique these transformations, integrating philosophy, economics, and history into a single framework. His legacy continues to shape debates about inequality, labour, and capitalism, but his significance lies above all in his role as a diagnostician of modernity. From an intellectual historical perspective, Marx's enduring importance lies not in the correctness of his conclusions, but in the depth and ambition of his attempt to comprehend a world undergoing unprecedented change, urbanization, industrialization, technologization, massive structural changes that were completely transforming the relationship of peoples within society. And these changes, these shifts were battling against one another, and they were influenced by that great thinker that we have already discussed, Hegel. So join us next week for a follow-up session revisiting the thought of Hegel, returning to his dialectical philosophy as explored in our earlier seminar on René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, and a brief chunk on Hegel, but much more to come, and considering more closely how his ideas underpin and shape the development of Karl Marx's theory of history. And perhaps it's something we can return to at the end of that session. But until then, I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts, any comments. Jack, if you have any concluding remarks, but otherwise that's everything I had for you, and I hope you will unite with the workers of the world. We have nothing to lose but our chains. which is also it's so funny how close that is to Rousseau talking about man ran freely into his chains in the Discourse on Inequality. But I'm not sure how much Marx actually read Rousseau and how much he would have actually been particularly fond of him. I imagine he would have found him frustrating.
I'm not sure, but I know that one of the more popular historians of modern philosophy, a guy called Karl Truban, quite closely allied Rousseau and Marx in his narrative of the rise of the modern idea of identity and the modern notion of the self.
But I mean, for Rousseau, man is born free and everywhere in chains. It's not necessarily, it's a sort of self-imposed bondage by subscribing to society as a whole, not necessarily anything. There is a wealth element, and that's why Rousseau is integrated into the left canon, but it's more that society itself is a fundamentally corrupt concept, and one needs to withdraw from that to rebuild a form of, communal living between people and reinterpret that. And I'm not sure necessarily. I think that would have been a little bit too, well, yeah, like he was saying about the early socialists, probably a little bit too utopian and sort of ideational rather than practical.
Possibly, but the actual word for communism comes from the very same communes that Rousseau had in mind, right?
As in the Paris Commune, that sort of thing. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily, it's influenced by Rousseau. I mean, the French revolutionaries pick up Rousseau as much as they do Voltaire and obviously and Diderot, and want to implement these ideas theoretically. But I wouldn't say that necessarily the French revolutionaries, in the same way that Lenin has a very different view to the ideology than Marx does. I would say that the French revolutionaries are not the best representation of Rousseauan ideals. But again, this is probably a discussion for yet another session on Rousseau. But I would say that they interpret quite a lot of what he thinks incorrectly. I don't think Rousseau would subscribe to anything really that the French revolutionaries had done. They took certain elements of his thought. But again, this is because his thought was ideational. There was no practical blueprint for how to run a state. As I've said before, there's kind of general ideas about having small states and as much direct participation as you can, but it's much more about the individual and how individuals operate within society, and sort of creating a moral citizenry, rather than a sort of structure for how to run the state. Which also Marx, it's interesting, isn't it, that kind of Soviet systems and things like that are so rigid, when a lot of what Marx is saying is obviously so theoretical, and a sort of Leninist rigidity that comes out of that, again, just seems quite wrong. I mean, I know there's this sort of stuff about violence, the iron fist of the workers that Marx does mention, but it seems to be far off from anything that he's practically discussing in his work, I think.
It's possible. Well, I mean, the Communist Manifesto is obviously very different literature to Das Kapital. So, and I don't know enough either enough to comment, but so I mean, the Communist Manifesto is a very polemic piece designed to stir up revolutionary sentiment. I don't know what kind of action it prescribes. But in Das Kapital, you obviously he makes revolutionary change a essential aspect of his theory of social transformation.
Yeah.
So it's logical that Lenin would seek to engineer such conditions.
But they should be essentially naturally causing and at the right time, rather than forced by a certain mover of that change.
But then that's a very strange idea, a revolution that happens organically.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there such a thing?
Well, that's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I guess it's always led by someone, but at the culmination, a culmination of multiple factors that lead to it, rather than being forced by one central organization. I mean, you could say that the initial revolution that takes place in Russia, the February Revolution that leads to the provisional government, that was quite natural. Bread riots, lack of food. But then the second one in October was a forced one, a coup d'etat, because the initial one, as far as they were concerned, hadn't gone far enough, and the Bolsheviks wanted to take power from the socialist revolutionaries and be the vanguard of the revolution themselves. So no, it's interesting, but I don't think that neither Rousseau or Marx in this case ideas are implemented because it's a different context. I mean, this is the thing, like the ideas may stay the same, but the situations change. So to say that either of those things are Rousseauan or Marxian, I think are very difficult points to argue. And this is the point of intellectual history, to understand where the parallels are. And you can see some parallels, whether it be linguistically, situationally, but at the same time, they are massively different contexts from the time each thinker lived to the revolutions that followed them. But maybe we should do an episode at some point on Rousseau and Marx and their respective revolutions. That would be quite good fun, that they inspired. But does anyone else have any other questions, any other points? Otherwise, we will let you enjoy the rest of your evening, imbued with revolutionary fervour and ready for a session on Hegel next Monday, Jack?
Yeah, next Monday, yeah. This coming Monday. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, well, I think that's probably it then. So thank you all very much indeed for joining, and we shall look forward to seeing you hopefully in a week's time for Jack's seminar and analysis of Hegelian thought.
Thank you very much. See you next week.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Louise.
Thank
you
you,
all. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
You too.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.